here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. One day, humans will no longer be able to live on Earth. It will likely be through no fault of our own, but rather because the sun itself is slowly growing hotter, and no planet gets to keep its star forever. Luckily, there's a solution. Ships the size of a city, with farmland curving overhead and rain that falls on schedule, where 10,000 people live whole lives, birth to old age, handing the voyage to their children like a family trade, for centuries, between one sun and the next. We call them generation ships. And tonight, we're going aboard. If you enjoy falling asleep to journeys that completely reshape how you see the universe, do me a small favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and lets me keep making these deep dives for you. Also, tell me in the comments where in the world you're falling asleep tonight. For now, dim the lights and settle in. Let your shoulders come down and your jaw unclench, because aboard this ship, the night watch is somebody else's job. The fields are breathing on schedule, and the water in the walls is already warm. Have you ever wondered what a world like that would actually need? Why the ship has to be mostly farm, and why its lungs are its bean fields? Why fish, of all things, become the perfect livestock? And the best loved place aboard turns out to be a fishing spot. How 8 people who sealed themselves inside a glass world, right here on Earth, watched their own air begin to vanish so slowly that nobody noticed. And how the walls themselves turned out to be eating the evidence. Why the school aboard outranks the engines. How you stop a ship the size of a city using nothing but wind. Why a ship that leaves later can arrive first, so that the hardest question isn't how to go, but when, and the strangest one of all. What is it like to be born in the middle of the crossing, to live your whole life between two shores, aboard a world where Earth is only a bedtime story? Let's begin. Morning aboard arrives the way it has for 200 years, rolling down the land. You wake in a timber-framed room, in a bed by a window, in a house your family has renewed board by board for 7 generations. Down the long middle of the world, the ship's sun is coming up. A line of warm light strengthening along the axis, and dawn moves across the countryside like a slow tide, waking the fields in order the way it has every morning since the shipyard. The hens are already fussing. Somewhere down the lane, the bakery is ahead of you, as bakeries always are. Your window stands open because the air outside it is always exactly the kind of morning the gardeners have scheduled, and on the sill sits the same view your great-grandmother grew up with. Rooftops, bean rows, the neighbour's plum tree, and behind all of it, through the great window at the far end of the world, the stars, perfectly still. They were still when your grandmother was a girl, and they'll be still when your granddaughter is an old woman. Because at the speeds even a starship sails, the sky doesn't visibly move in a lifetime. You live mid-ocean, mid-crossing, deep in the middle generations of the longest journey our species ever began. Earth is a story your family tells. Arrival is a story your family tells. What's real is this morning, this lane, this smell of bread, this world. And what a world! Step out into the lane and look up, because the view is unlike anything in human experience so far. You're standing on the inside of the hull, on grass, under trees, and the land does not fall away to a horizon. It rises, gently. On both sides, the fields and lanes and rooftops curve up and away, climbing into the distance until, far overhead, past the soft glare of the ship's sun, you can make out the far side of the world hanging upside down, someone's orchard directly above your bed, someone's pond glinting where your sky should be. At the ends of the great cylinder stand the end caps, round walls kilometres across, set with windows like enormous rose windows in a cathedral, wheeling slowly with the spin, stars sliding past the glass. A newcomer from Earth would spend a dizzy week refusing to look up. You never see it at all. in the way you don't see your own ceiling. To you, it's just the world, the dear ordinary shape of home, land above and land below. Years from now, if your descendants ever stand on some flat planet under an endless open sky, it's the flatness that will frighten them, all that land just ending at the edge of sight, and nothing overhead but weatherless blue going up forever. Eeriness, it turns out, is just unfamiliarity wearing a mask. Hold that thought all night. Aboard the ship, everything we'd find strange becomes, within one generation, simply what home looks like, and notice what the world feels like to your senses, because it doesn't feel like a spacecraft at all. Ask the people who've lived in our sealed places, the research stations, the underwater habitats, the submarines, and they all report the same surprise. What you notice is the smell. A closed world smells like itself, permanently. A signature you stop noticing in a week and would recognize with your eyes shut for the rest of your life. Yours is layered, like anywhere real. Wet soil and cut greens near the farms. Bread, because the bakers are at it, and they're always at it somewhere. Machine oil and warm metal down in engine country, ozone near the shops. And under all of it, the faint mineral sweetness of the water in the walls, the smell a ship child will one day, on some far world, catch a ghost of in an ordinary rain shower and find herself unaccountably homesick. The sounds are just as domestic. A world like this is never silent and never loud. The ventilation breathes, a soft, steady wind down every lane. The structure ticks and settles as the ship's sun warms it, the way your house ticks in the evening. Frogs own the pond decks at dusk and have never once given them back. This thing you live inside wakes and rains and smells of bread and argues with itself at dusk in birdsong. Somewhere between the blueprints, the vehicle became a place. The day itself is almost suspiciously ordinary, and that's the design working. You put in your shift, in the growing decks or the shops or the clinic, and like everyone aboard you, hold your work two-handed, half doing it, half teaching it, because every skill here lives only as long as its chain of teachers. The children are in school, which the ship ranks, quite formally, above the engines, below the fields, down in engine country. The watch is awake around the small fires that light the world, the way somebody has been awake down there every single night for 2 centuries. In the evening, the shutters fold the light away on schedule, the dusk chorus argues itself to sleep, lamps come up warm in the windows along your lane, and you walk home the way ship children have always walked, one hand trailing the warm metal of the water wall, the way you'd touch a grandmother's shoulder in passing. Somewhere behind you, a child asks her father where the rain comes from, and he gives the oldest answer aboard. The same place it went. Love. Around and around. By full dark, the lanes are quiet. 10,000 people are asleep inside one machine, and the machine is doing the only thing it was ever built to do. It's keeping them, the way Earth, tonight, is keeping you. So now you've lived a day aboard, and you can feel what the ship really is, and it isn't a vehicle. Nobody aboard experiences travel. There's no motion, no engine note, no scenery sliding past. Just a world, complete and warm, that happens to be somewhere new each century. The ship is a place, which means the real question of tonight was never what riding a generation ship would feel like. You know now. It feels like home. The real questions are the ones underneath, and they're enormous. Who builds a world like this, and why? How do you make a machine breathe for 5 centuries? What must it survive, and what do the people aboard owe each other, and what happens on the far morning when the stars outside the window finally move? That's the rest of tonight. Let's take it from the top, slowly, the way the builders would. And start with the garden, because everything you just walked through comes back to the garden. Back here on Earth tonight, maybe you keep a few pots on a windowsill, or there's a tree on your street that somebody, long ago, decided to plant. Think about what a garden actually is. It's a piece of the world that only works because someone keeps showing up. Water it, weed it, feed the soil, and it feeds you back. Walk away for a year, and it quietly unravels. Now hold that thought, because the ship you just woke up on is exactly that, the largest garden ever imagined, sealed inside a steel bottle the size of a city, sailing between the stars for 500 years. Every deck, every engine, every law aboard exists to answer a single gardener's question. Can you build a garden that outlives every gardener who will ever tend it? So why would we ever build it? Because of the quiet fact underneath everything tonight. Earth, beloved and steady as it feels beneath your bed, is not forever. Nothing that orbits a star is. Now, our sun is astonishingly steady, and it'll keep this planet warm for a very long time yet, but it is, very slowly, turning up the heat. The sun grows a little brighter every 100 million years, and in about 1 billion years that brightness will start to trouble the oceans. That's a real deadline, written in physics, and it's the calmest emergency there has ever been. 1 billion years is 10,000 times longer than our whole species has existed. Nobody builds a lifeboat on a Tuesday for a flood due in 1 billion years, and the sudden dangers, the falling rocks, are actually the solvable kind. We've already reached out and nudged an asteroid onto a new path, just to prove we could. Planets can duck now, a little. So no, the honest reason for the ship isn't fear. It's the same reason there are footprints on the moon and wheel tracks on Mars. Our species has never once looked at a far shore and decided, permanently, to stay home. Though, if you want one more practical reason, the sky does offer a quiet one. Stars move, drifting through the galaxy on their own long roads, and every few 100,000 years one wanders uncomfortably near our neighborhood. There's a small orange star out there right now, in fact, falling gently in our direction, due to brush past the outskirts of our solar system in roughly 1 million years. Not a collision, nothing so crude, just a stranger passing close enough to rattle the gate, to nudge the deep cloud of sleeping comets at the edge of our system, and, over ages, send a few of them drifting sunward. Nothing about it threatens anyone alive, or anyone's descendants for 10,000 generations. But it makes a point worth taking to heart before a voyage. A solar system isn't a locked room, it's a harbour with weather, and harbours with weather teach their sailors a rule old as boats. However much you love the harbour, know how to sail. A species that can build one working ark never has to build one in a hurry. That's the actual argument, when the philosophers finish with it. Not escape, but insurance of the calmest kind. The kind you buy precisely so that nothing ever forces your hand. But here's what makes the far shore so different this time. The distances involved break something in the mind. The nearest star to our sun sits a little over 4 light years away. 4 years for light, the fastest thing there is. And light, from your bed tonight, is not a fair yardstick, because nothing we build gets anywhere near it. Think of it like this instead. The starlight resting on your window right now left home years ago, and it made the trip in one smooth run. No engine, no fuel, no crew. We can't travel the way light travels. We have to push metal through the dark, and metal is heavy, and pushing is expensive. The gap between what light does effortlessly and what we can do at all, that gap is the whole story of tonight. And we know exactly how wide that gap is, because we've already built our fastest possible messenger. Here's the story, and it starts with a man being laughed at. In the 1950s, a young physicist named Eugene Parker sat down with the arithmetic of the sun's outer atmosphere and found something nobody wanted to believe. Space, he said, isn't still. The sun breathes. It pours out a thin, fast wind of particles, millions of tons of itself every second, streaming past every planet all the time. The experts of the day called it nonsense. His paper was rejected by both reviewers. It survived only because the journal's editor, a stubborn genius in his own right, overruled them both. Then the first space probes flew, and there it was, exactly as Parker said, a wind from the sun, blowing through everything. Decades later, our fastest ever spacecraft was named in his honor. The first spacecraft ever named for a living person, and he watched it leave an old man from a field in the warm dark. Hold on to that wind, by the way, and tuck it somewhere safe. At the very end of tonight's voyage, that wind, or one just like it, is going to be the thing that saves the ship. That probe, Parker's namesake, now swings past the sun at about 200 kilometers every second. 200 kilometers every second between one breath of yours and the next. It's the fastest object our species has ever made. And here's the sentence worth sitting with. Even at that speed, the trip to the nearest star would take more than 6,000 years. 6,000. At the pace of our older probes, the ones already sailing out past the planets, it's more like 75,000. The pyramids were built about 45 centuries ago. A voyage of 6,000 years, launched the day the first pyramid opened, would still be going. So, the crossing can't be done in a lifetime, or 10 lifetimes, or 50. Not with anything we have, and not most likely with anything our grandchildren will have. The gap is simply that wide. So what do you actually do with a road that no life is long enough to walk? Well, there are exactly 2 doors, and the first door is speed. Not a little more speed, thousands of times more. Fast enough to squeeze the crossing into decades. There are serious designs for that, and later tonight we'll ride one of them, a machine that surfs its own drumbeat of tiny suns. But real speed, for anything big enough to hold a town, costs energy on a scale that makes a whole civilization sweat. We'll do that arithmetic when we get to the engines, and you'll see why it humbles everyone who runs it. Door 2 is stranger and older. If the road takes centuries, stop trying to shorten the road and lengthen the traveler instead. Stop building a vehicle that survives the trip and start building a place that lives it. Take the whole town with you, the garden and the schools and the workshops. Take the weather, take the mornings. Let the voyage have grandparents in it, and babies, and harvest festivals. Let time do what time does, just somewhere else. And if door 2 sounds like something our species has never tried, look at a map of the largest ocean on Earth. Thousands of islands, scattered across a third of the planet, and people reached nearly every one of them centuries before anyone had a compass. How? In double-hulled canoes, built with stone tools, sailed by families who knew they might never come home. And here's the part that matters for tonight. They didn't just bring supplies, they brought a world. Taro shoots wrapped in wet moss, breadfruit saplings, pigs, chickens, dogs, seeds for the gardens they intended to plant on shores they had never seen and could not prove existed. Each canoe was a little ark of the whole life they knew, packed to take root somewhere new. And they navigated, without instruments, by exactly the things our starship will use. Stars, and their risings and settings, memorized in their hundreds, the feel of the swell through the hull, the flight lines of birds at dusk. Their navigators trained from childhood, decades of apprenticeship, the knowledge passed down chants and star maps woven into song because it was too precious to trust to any one memory. Sound familiar yet? It should, because it's the whole design of tonight's ship, in miniature, 1,000 years early. The voyages were weeks and months, not centuries, so let's not stretch the parallel further than it goes. But the pattern is proven, and it's ours. When humans cross an impossible ocean, they do it as gardeners, carrying their world with them, steering by the stars, and trusting the knowledge to song. We've done this before, just never at this size. And notice what that decision quietly does. The moment you choose door 2, the problem changes shape. It stops being an engineering question about speed and becomes a gardener's question about care. A fast ship asks, "Can we survive the crossing?" A generation ship asks something much deeper. Can we build a world small enough to launch and complete enough to live in? Not to visit, but to live in, womb to grave, generation after generation, with nothing arriving from outside except starlight. Every system your body quietly borrows from Earth tonight, the air you're breathing, the water in the glass by your bed, the food becoming you as you lie there, the pull holding you to the mattress, all of it has to be packed, shrunk, sealed, and made to run for centuries without a single delivery. It's the largest thing we've ever imagined building, and the drawings already exist and have, in one form or another, for about 100 years. Because here's the lovely, improbable truth we'll walk through next. This idea wasn't born in our lifetime, or in the space age at all. It was born with a deaf schoolteacher in a log house in the Russian countryside, doing arithmetic by candlelight. It grew up inside a sealed envelope that one of the fathers of rocketry was too embarrassed to publish. An envelope with instructions that it only be opened by people of a wiser century. It was almost built, for real, in the desert, by a physicist who wanted to ride atomic fire, until a treaty about weapons quietly ended the only Starship program that ever had a budget. And it reached its full size in the 1970s. In a university lecture hall, when a professor asked his students a question so simple it rearranged everything. So, let's meet the dreamers properly. The ship deserves its family album. The school teacher comes first, because everything traces back to him. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky lost most of his hearing to scarlet fever as a boy, was pulled out of school, and educated himself in a library, alone, for years. He became a teacher in a small town and spent his evenings working out, from first principles, how rockets must work. This was before airplanes, long before, and in between the equations that would one day carry every astronaut, he wrote something gentler. He imagined humanity outgrowing its planet the way a child outgrows a cradle. Earth is the cradle of the mind, he wrote. But one cannot live in the cradle forever, and he sketched the consequence nobody had dared to sketch. Great slow arcs. He called them cosmic dwellings. Greenhouses in space, carrying forests and families outward over centuries. Not warships, not explorers' capsules, but dwellings, homes that travel. 100 years before anyone could build so much as a satellite, the deaf schoolteacher had already understood that the stars would be reached by gardeners, not by heroes, and he didn't stop at the idea. He furnished it. In his notebooks, and in a strange, lovely novel he wrote about life beyond the air, Tsiolkovsky drew what his travelers would actually need, and page after page, its plants. Long greenhouse galleries running the length of his dwellings, fruit trees growing fat in the weightless middle where no branch has to carry its own load, vegetables in their beds, sunlight managed with mirrors. He worked out that a person and a garden could balance each other. Breath for breath, the person exhaling what the plants drink, the plants exhaling what the person needs, a little two-part engine of air. He even worried, wonderfully, about the small things, how the travelers would bathe, how they'd handle tools, what they'd do all day, which he decided would be mostly science and gardening, which tells you everything about the man. Remember, he was writing this in a wooden house in a small town, by lamplight. A man who could barely hear the world he was planning to leave. His neighbours thought him odd, when they thought of him at all. And the plans that came out of that quiet house, checked now against a century of spaceflight, hold up almost embarrassingly well. We've had to correct his arithmetic here and there. We've never once had to correct the furniture. The ship still needs exactly what he packed for it. Air made by leaves, and something growing, and work worth doing in the morning. Then comes the sealed envelope, and I think it's one of the most touching objects in the history of science. Robert Goddard, the American father of the liquid rocket, the man the Great Space Center is named for, wrote an essay in 1918 called The Last Migration. In it, he let himself imagine the far, far future. The sun failing and humanity leaving, in slow arcs steered between the stars, carrying everything worth carrying, with crews who would sleep and generations who would tend the ship. Then he sealed it, because he genuinely believed the idea was too far ahead to survive ridicule, that publishing it would end his career before it began. So he locked his boldest thought in an envelope, marked in effect for the future, and went back to being laughed at for merely proposing rockets to the moon. The envelope stayed sealed for more than half a century. It was opened and published only after his death, when the world had finally caught up to the smaller of his two dreams. The larger one, the Ark, is still waiting. You're holding a piece of it tonight. The next dreamer gave the ship its shape, and he did it in a slim little book that fits in a coat pocket. In 1929, a young Irish scientist named John Desmond Bernal, one of the founders of the science of looking inside crystals, sat down and asked what humanity's long-term home would actually look like. Not the rocket, the home. His answer was a hollow globe, miles across, built in open space, with tens of thousands of people living on the inside of the shell. Sunlight in, waste heat out, everything else looping around and around inside, forever. Air, water, food, all of it circling like the goldfish in a well-kept bowl. Read those pages today and your neck prickles, because what he's describing, casually, decades before the first satellite, is a complete artificial biosphere. He understood the deep rule on Night 1, the rule this whole episode leans on. The hard part of leaving Earth isn't the leaving. It's the bringing Earth along. Then, for one strange decade, the dream nearly got a budget. In the late 1950s, in a lab by the ocean in California, a small team began designing a ship called Orion, and there has never been anything like it since. The idea sounds like a dare. You build a colossal steel plate, mounted on shock absorbers the size of grain silos, and underneath it, one after another, you set off small atomic charges. Each blast kicks the plate. The plate kicks the ship. Boom, 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 a drumbeat of tiny suns, and the whole thing rises, riding fire. It sounds unhinged, and it genuinely worked on paper, and the men who ran the numbers were not dreamers you could dismiss. One of them was Freeman Dyson, among the deepest physicists of his century. He spent a year on Orion, and called it the most exciting year of his life. The team flew a small test model on ordinary explosives, and there's still film of it. A trash can-shaped thing hopping into the sky on a string of bangs, steady as a metronome. Dyson worked out the grown-up version too, the interstellar one, a ship the size of a small city, a quarter of its weight in charges, working itself up to a few % of the speed of light. Slow boat to the stars. A century or two per crossing. Real physics. Real steel. A real price tag. Then, in 1963, the great powers signed a treaty banning atomic tests everywhere except underground, and Orion, which was nothing but atomic tests, quietly ceased to exist. It remains the only Starship program in history cancelled by an arms control treaty. Dyson mourned it his whole life, and also agreed with the treaty, and held both of those at once, which tells you something about the man. The baton passed, of all places, to a pub. Through the 1970s, a group of British engineers and scientists, members of a venerable rocket society that had been mocked for decades for taking spaceflight seriously, met in the evenings, unpaid, upstairs rooms and borrowed offices and, yes, sometimes the pub, to design a Starship properly, nuts and bolts and fuel budgets, and they called their ship Daedalus. It took them 5 years, and the design still commands respect today. Daedalus wouldn't ride bombs but fusion, the sun's own trick. In its engine bell, tiny frozen pellets of heavy hydrogen would be crushed by electron beams, 250 of them every second. Each one a miniature star igniting and dying faster than a blink, their fire caught and aimed by invisible magnetic fields. Its pantry was even wilder than its engine. The best pellet fuel is vanishingly rare on Earth, but the giant planets are full of it. So the plan called for robot balloon refineries drifting in the clouds of Jupiter for 20 years, skimming fuel for the voyage. 2 stages, 50 years of flight, and it would reach a nearby star, moving at about 1/10 of the speed of light. And then, and here's the detail that matters for our ship tonight, it would keep going. Daedalus couldn't stop. Nobody could afford the fuel to stop. Half a century of engineering and flight for one single day of frantic photography as the target star and its worlds whipped past and shrank behind. The lesson was carved into every study that came after. Getting up to speed is only half the bill. The universe charges you again, full price, to slow back down. Remember that. Because the bill comes due at the end of tonight. And then the idea grew to its final size in, of all places, a freshman physics seminar. In 1969, a Princeton professor named Gerard O'Neill, a particle physicist with a restless streak, gave his brightest students a question instead of a syllabus. Is the surface of a planet really the right place for an expanding technological civilization? Everyone in the room assumed the answer was obviously yes. The numbers, run honestly, kept disagreeing. Work it through, and a planet starts to look like a strange place to live. Half of it is always facing away from the light. Most of its matter is buried where you can't use it, and its gravity taxes every kilogram you lift. Build instead, said the arithmetic, in open space, where the sun never sets and structure is cheap. O'Neill and his students sketched what became the most famous habitats never built. Great paired cylinders, kilometers across and tens of kilometers long, spinning gently in the light. You'd live on the inside, of course. Farms and towns wrapping overhead, long window strips running the length of the land, mirrors folding morning in and shutters folding it back out at night. Weight from spin, weather from sunlight and water, land area of a decent county, population of a small nation, climate set by committee. He published it in a serious physics journal in 1974, testified before lawmakers, inspired a movement. The cylinders were designed as neighbors for Earth, parked in friendly orbits nearby. But look at what he'd actually drawn. A complete, sealed, spinning world, indefinitely self-sufficient, that doesn't care where it is. Give that world an engine and a rudder, and there's our ship. The generation ship is an O'Neill cylinder that slipped its mooring. So we have the family album. Now let's actually build the thing, plate by plate, and find out what it takes to keep the dark outside. Begin with where it gets built, because the answer sets the scale of everything. You don't launch a city. Nothing that will ever stand on a launch pad can hold a forest. The ship gets built the way harbors get built, in place, over decades, in high orbit where it will eventually sail from. Its bones come from space itself. There are mountains loose up there, asteroids of iron and stone and ice drifting by the million, and a civilization ready to build arcs is a civilization already mining them. Metal smelted in solar furnaces, water cracked out of dark ice, all of it far cheaper than lifting one girder out of Earth's deep gravity. The ship rises rib by rib in the sunlight like a whale skeleton coming together, and the first crews live aboard the construction site itself, which means the town starts being a town years before it ever moves. Children are born in the shipyard. The voyage, in a sense, begins at the welding, and what a strange, wonderful place that shipyard is for the 50 or 80 years it takes. Picture it in the middle decades. The twin hulls hang half-plated in the permanent sunlight. tug craft drifting along them like minnows along whales. A captured ice asteroid, dirty grey and huge, is being patiently dismantled nearby, its water destined for the shield walls, its dust for the soil works. Solar furnaces, mirrors focused to a fierce point, run day and night, which up there are the same thing, turning asteroid iron into honest beams. And here's the detail I love most, the one that tells you what kind of project this really is. Years before the hull is even sealed, while the frames are still open to the stars, the soil barns are already running. Because living soil takes a generation to grow, and nobody can hurry it. The first tree goes into the ground, into ground that is itself a manufactured miracle. While there's still vacuum where the sky will be, the gardeners start before the plumbers finish, because they have no choice. On this project, the gardeners always started first. Then comes the day the books will call spin up, and it deserves its bells. The hulls are sealed, the water walls filled, the air let in, warm and new, and the great engines along the rim, used this once for this purpose, begin to turn the world, slowly, because it takes months to bring a country-sized cylinder up to its lazy 2-minute waltz, and through those months, weight arrives. Gently, a little more each week, dust settling for the first time, ponds finding their level, rain becoming possible. Somewhere in there, a crew member sets a cup on a table and it stays, and everyone gathered pretends that's normal, and it is not normal. It's the first cup set down on a table, in a world that people made. The trees, young and staked, feel their first honest down, and begin growing toward their first honest up. The world, from that day, simply works. All that's left is to cast off, which happens not with a roar but with a shove, so gentle the tea doesn't ripple. Years of patient thrust beginning their long addition. Somewhere aft, a very old promise starts keeping itself. The shape, when it's done, is a pair of cylinders lying side by side under the stars, spinning in opposite directions. Why a pair? Because a single spinning body slowly wrestles anything that tries to hold it steady. And two counter-spinning hulls cancel each other beautifully, the way two gears mesh. Each hull is a few kilometers across and a few tens of kilometers long. Those numbers sound arbitrary, and they're anything but. They fall straight out of the two things the ship must manufacture for its people every second of every day for centuries: weight and weather. And weight comes first, because your body was designed by weight, and it does not forgive its absence. You stood inside this view at the very start of tonight, the land rising on both sides, the far country hanging overhead. Now let's earn it. And while we're at the engineering, look down the length of the land to the ends of the world, because that's where the ship keeps its doors. At the center of each great end cap, right on the axis where weight fades to nothing, sits the harbor, the docking core, and it's the one place aboard that still feels like spacecraft. Shuttles and tugs rest in their cradles there, patient as rowboats in a boathouse, kept forever ready for a day centuries off. And from the harbor, through the locks, comes and goes the strangest profession on the manifest: the hull walkers. Somebody has to inspect the outside, the bow shields, slow wounds, the radiator wings, the seams, and machines do most of it, but 5 centuries teach a firm lesson about trusting eyes. So a small guild suits up, generation after generation, clips onto the long lines, and walks the night side of the world. Picture that work for a second. Your boots on the hull's outer skin, your whole home country turning slowly under your feet and over your shoulder. When you straighten up from a weld, nothing. Not dark like a room is dark. The whole original dark. Every star sharp as a pin. The target sun, one grain of light dead ahead off the bow. Hull walkers are famously quiet people, and famously few of them ever quit. Ask them why, and they mostly say the same thing. It's the only place aboard where you can see where you're going. Then they clip the line to the next stanchion and keep walking, patient as gardeners weeding a row, which, when you think about it, is exactly what they are. So, how do you give a floating city its weight back? Here's the trick, and it's the oldest trick in the book. Swing a bucket of water in a fast circle, and the water stays pressed into the bucket, even upside down. Spin the ship, and everyone inside is the water. The hull swings you in an enormous circle. The floor constantly pulls you around the curve, and your body reads that pull as weight. Get the size and the spin right, and it feels exactly like home. Stand on the inside of the hull, and you weigh what you weigh tonight. Drop your keys and they fall. Pour tea, and it lands in the cup. But the size genuinely matters, and here's why small ships fail at this. Your inner ear is a precision instrument, and on a tight ring spinning fast, it notices. Turn your head, and the room seems to swing. Walk against the spin and you feel oddly heavy. Walk with it and you're strangely light. And within an hour, half the crew is seasick. The cure, happily, is nothing but radius. Make the circle big enough, a couple of kilometers across, and the spin needed for full Earth weight drops to about 1 lazy turn every 2 minutes. At that pace, the trickery drops below what your ear can detect. The world just feels like the world, though the children always find the seams. Climb the long stairs toward the ship's axis, and you weigh less with every flight. And at the very center, along the spine of the ship, weight fades to nothing at all. Every design ever drawn puts something joyful there, because it can't be helped. The middle of every generation ship is the best playground ever built, a place where a child can spread her arms and fly. Remember the axis, by the way. When we plant the gardens, something lovely happens up there. Now wrap it, because outside the hull waits an emptiness with weather of its own. The first layer of defense is against the dust, because space is not clean. Between the stars drift grains, most smaller than sand, and at the speeds a starship travels, small stops meaning harmless. At 1% of the speed of light, a single grain of sand arrives carrying the energy of a hand grenade. At Daedalus speeds, make it a bomb. You cannot armor your way out of this with thickness alone, but in the 1940s, a comet astronomer named Fred Whipple, a man who spent his life studying exactly the stuff that makes meteors, had one of those ideas that looks obvious the moment after somebody has it. Don't build one thick wall. Build a thin skin held out on standoffs ahead of the real wall. The incoming grain hits the thin skin and destroys itself, bursting into a small cloud of vapor, and the cloud spreads before it reaches the true hull, arriving as a soft slap instead of a bullet. He called it a meteor bumper. Every serious spacecraft flies behind Whipple's trick to this day, and our ship wears the grown-up version. Its blunt bow, the face that meets the voyage head-on, is a fat sacrificial shield of ice and slag many meters thick, going first into the dark for centuries. Absorbing the sandblast, renewed by patient crews the way a harbour town repaints its seawall. The bow takes the weather so the gardens never feel it. The second rain never announces itself at all, and it's the one the ship takes most seriously. Between the stars there is radiation. A thin, permanent drizzle of atomic nuclei, thrown out by exploded stars all over the galaxy, crossing space at nearly the speed of light. We call them cosmic rays, and they're passing through your bedroom right now, a few every second. Through the roof, through the blanket, through you. So why don't you feel them tonight? Because they're sparse down here, and they're sparse because you live behind two magnificent shields you never see. The whole thickness of Earth's atmosphere stands over your bed tonight, pressing down with the weight of 10 meters of water, and around all of it wraps the planet's magnetic field, gently combing the worst of the storm aside. The ship has neither, so it does the honest thing. It brings mass, and it chooses that mass with real elegance. Wrapped around the living decks, jacketing the whole inhabited world, are tanks holding meters of water, Water happens to be superb at soaking up radiation, and the ship must carry enormous stores of it anyway, so the engineers make one thing do three jobs. The crew's drinking water is their shield, is their thermal ballast. The people of the ship live their whole lives wrapped inside their own reservoir, the way a seed rides inside the wet of the fruit. Under their feet, the deep soil beds of the farms add another quiet layer. On a generation ship, even the shielding is partly garden. And there's one more piece of outside weather, and here's a question that surprises everyone the first time they meet it. How do you keep a city warm in deep space? You mostly don't have to, wonderfully. The problem isn't staying warm. Vacuum is the best thermos ever made, and a sealed city full of bodies and machines and sun lamps makes heat relentlessly, every hour, forever. The ship's real problem is getting rid of warmth. Heat can only leave by glowing away. So out along the hull spread huge, thin radiator panels, dark wings threaded with circulating fluid, shedding the city's warmth into space as a faint infrared glow, which produces, as a side effect, something almost tender. Seen from far away with the right eyes, the ship's brightest signature isn't its engine or its lights. It's its body heat, a warm speck crossing the cold, glowing quietly with the accumulated warmth of its dinners and machines and sleeping children. If anyone out there is watching the dark the way we watch it, that's what they'd see of us, a firefly, keeping its people warm. But the deepest specification of the hull has nothing to do with dust or rays, and everything to do with time. Every machine you own was built by a civilization that could replace it. Your phone is glued shut because somewhere there's a factory making the next one. So the ship is built on the opposite philosophy from almost everything in your house. And the philosophy has teeth. Nothing sealed. Nothing that can't be opened with tools the ship can make. Every pump, every valve, every panel reachable by a person in a corridor sized for carrying its replacement. Machine shops aboard that can manufacture every part of the machine shops themselves, which sounds circular until you realize it's the whole point. The ship must be able to give birth to itself, endlessly, from its own stores and its own hands. Engineers have a dry name for this, maintainability, but live with it for a moment and you'll see what it really is. It's a world built the way a garden is kept, on the assumption of endless, patient tending. Everything prunable, everything replantable, nothing beyond the reach of the gardener's hands. The hull, in the end, is just the garden wall. And a wall, however magnificent, is the easy half. Tomorrow the dark outside would happily take centuries off. The world inside cannot take a single day off. So now we go through the airlock, into the light, where the actual miracle has to happen. Now we have to make it breathe, take a slow breath before we go inside. Really, take one. That breath is about to become the whole subject, because the air you just borrowed was made for you. Tonight, by things that are alive. The oxygen came from plants and from oceans full of green specks too small to see, working sunlight the way they've worked it for billions of years. Your body burned it, breathed out carbon, and somewhere tonight a leaf will quietly take that carbon back and hand out fresh oxygen in the morning. You live inside a loop. Everyone does. Earth is the loop, a sealed garden that has run without resupply for 4 billion years, taking in nothing but sunlight, giving off nothing but warmth, cycling every atom of air and water and soil around and around through every living thing. Nothing is ever delivered to Earth. Nothing needs to be. That's the miracle the ship has to copy. And now you know why this episode keeps calling the ship a garden. It isn't decoration. The garden is the machine. The lungs of a generation ship are its bean fields. Let's walk the loops one at a time, the way the ship's own children learn them in school, air first. On the ship, the farms breathe in what the people breathe out, and the people breathe in what the farms breathe out. Turn and turn about, forever. The great farm decks that curve overhead are not just the pantry, they're the lungs. Let the crops sicken and the air itself starts to change, which is why, aboard, agriculture isn't a trade. It's the priesthood. Water next. And here's a question to make you hold your glass differently. How old is the water beside your bed? Older than you think, because it has all been drunk before. All of Earth's water is ancient and endlessly reused, filtered through ground and cloud and river, through dinosaurs, honestly, through everyone who has ever lived. The ship just shrinks that cycle from a planet to a bottle. Every shower, every teacup, every tear aboard is recovered, cleaned, and sent around again. Our space station already does this beautifully. More than 9 litres out of every 10 aboard come back. Breath and sweat condensed at the cold panels. Everything reclaimed. And the crews will tell you, cheerfully, that yesterday's coffee becomes tomorrow's coffee. What the station can't do is food. Every meal up there arrives by rocket from a warehouse in the world below. A generation ship gets no packages. Not one, not ever. Which brings us to the pantry. And the pantry is where the real estate goes. Because how much of a starship do you suppose it takes to feed a sealed town? Here's the honest arithmetic. The ship is mostly farm. Not mostly engine, not mostly quarters. Farm. Stacked growing decks under engineered daylight, wheat and rice and potatoes and beans, greens by the hectare, ponds of quicksilver fish, chickens fussing in the warm straw. Nothing aboard is wasteful enough to be a cow. A cow spends most of what you feed it just being a cow, and a sealed world can't afford majestic inefficiency. So the ship's farming is the tight, clever kind, every stalk and peel and scrap looping back into the beds. And under all of it lies the quietest treasure on the ship, the thing the crew guards more carefully than the reactor, soil. It's easy to think soil is just ground-up rock. It's not even close. A single handful of good garden soil holds more living things than there are people on Earth. A whole invisible nation of bacteria and fungi and worms and mites, trading, digesting, building. That living net is what makes dirt into a garden. And you cannot print it, you cannot rush it. Living soil is grown, slowly, by feeding it for years, which means the ship's soil is its oldest machine, older than the hull, started in the shipyard a generation before departure and tended ever since like a sourdough passed down a family. The bees ride along too, hives of them, treated like crown jewels, because most of the pantry needs pollinators. There are orchards on Earth where the bees vanished. And every spring people climb the trees to do the bees' work by hand, dabbing blossom after blossom with little brushes. It works. It's also a warning label the ship's designers took to heart. Lose a species and somebody's grandchildren inherit its job. Down on the lowest farm decks, where the spin makes everything heaviest and the water likes to settle, lie the ponds. And the ponds are the farm's quiet masterpiece. Fish are the sealed world's perfect livestock. They're cold-blooded, so they don't burn their feed keeping warm the way we do. And they turn scraps into supper faster than anything with legs, so the loops link up. Trimmings and leavings feed the ponds, the fish feed the people, and the pond's rich water, full of exactly what roots crave, is pumped gently back through the growing beds, which clean it and send it home again. Water to leaf, to plate, to pond, around and around, the whole pantry holding hands with itself. Ducks, in most designs, get the run of the place, part pest control, part comedy, and there are always a few hens down there too, working the margins for insects. But here's what the planners never anticipated and every simulation of shipboard life quietly predicts. The pond decks become the favourite place aboard. Warm, humid, green-smelling, full of the sound of moving water in a world with no rivers. Old people fish there in the evenings, not because the ship needs it, the nets do the real harvest, but because a bench beside water is a bench beside water anywhere in the universe. Kids learn to swim there under the light spine's dusk. The ship's oldest joke, in most of the stories written about these voyages, is some version of the same tender complaint. We built a starship, and the best thing in it is a fishing spot. This matters more than it sounds like it matters, so let's give it a minute. When planners first drew up ship farms, they optimized everything: calories per square meter, protein per liter of water, and the plans came out flawless and bleak, all potatoes and soy and joyless efficiency. Then the people who study long isolation looked at those plans and quietly sent them back. Because every winter station, every submarine patrol, every long expedition in our history says the same thing with one voice: delight is not a luxury. On the dark months of an Antarctic winter, the thing crews remember, the thing that held them, is never the nutrition. It's the fresh tomato in July, the smell of someone baking on a Sunday, the 2 rows of flowers somebody planted in the hydroponics rack against regulations, and every station has that somebody, and nobody ever reports them. Morale, it turns out, is a life support system, as real as oxygen, with its own failure modes and its own engineering. So the real ship carries tea terraces and coffee if the mass budget can possibly bow that far, and spice gardens, hops and grapes, chilies, vanilla if the pollination team is feeling brave, flowers with no calories in them at all, grown on purpose, by the acre. A ship that carries only what people need will arrive with people who need nothing, and that's not a crew. The garden's job was never just to keep the crew alive. It's to keep them glad they are, for 500 years, which is a much harder engineering spec, and the flowers are load-bearing. And the garden gives the ship one more gift, the one nobody expects: weather, real weather, indoors. Remember the axis, the weightless spine where the children fly? Warmth rises aboard, just as it does here, and rising air gets lighter and lighter as it climbs toward the center, until, along the spine of the world, the moisture of the fields and ponds gathers into actual clouds. Small ones, soft ones, strung down the axis like wool on a line. Sometimes, if the cycles line up, it rains. Mirrors and shutters fold the light away each evening. The long window strips dim, the birds go through their whole dusk argument and settle, and the clouds over the playground turn pink in the last of the lamplight. People who model these worlds keep discovering the same thing. You don't have to add beauty. Run a world honestly, and beauty condenses out of the plumbing. And everything your senses met on this morning's walk, the bread and the birdsong and the mineral sweetness of the water walls, is this same truth wearing its everyday clothes. The designers set out to draw a machine, and somewhere between the blueprints, it became a place. Now for the rehearsal. Because we've actually tried a version of all this. And what happened is one of the great instructive stories of our time. In the early 1990s, in the warm high desert of Arizona, a crew of 8 sealed themselves inside a glass and steel world about the size of 3 football fields. It was called Biosphere 2, on the logic that Earth is Biosphere 1. Under its glass pyramids it held a shrunken planet, a little rainforest, a little desert, a mangrove marsh, a farm, even a small ocean with a coral reef and a machine to make waves. The mission was simple to state and enormous to attempt. 2 years inside, grow your food, recycle your air and water, touch nothing outside. Among the 8 were a young woman named Jane Pointer, who ran the farm, and an engineer named Tabor McCallum, and the 2 of them fell in love in there, inside the sealed world, and married after, and spent the rest of their careers building life support for space. The doors closed, the cameras left, and for a while it worked. Then, slowly, in a way no alarm was designed to catch, something began to vanish, the oxygen. When they sealed the doors, the air inside held the normal share, about 1/5 of every breath. Month by month, it slipped. Nobody could see it or smell it. The instruments saw it, but the fall was so slow it read like a drift, then like a puzzle, then like a problem. Over a year and a half, it sank by a third, until the 8 of them were living, without having moved, at the thin air of a serious mountain summit. They climbed their stairs, gasping. Some woke at night because their bodies kept forgetting to breathe deeply enough. And the strangest part was that the arithmetic refused to balance. If something was eating the oxygen, it should have been exhaling carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide wasn't there either. Where was it going? The books wouldn't close. Something inside their world was consuming air and hiding the evidence, and they couldn't find it. The answer, when it finally came, is the single best lesson any starship designer has ever been handed. So let's give it its own moment. The builders had made the farm soil rich, generously rich, to be safe. Too rich. The invisible nation in the soil threw a feast. Microbes bloomed by the trillion, gorging and breathing, drawing down oxygen and pouring out carbon dioxide exactly as the books predicted, but the carbon dioxide never showed up in the air. Because the building itself was drinking it. The structure's concrete was still young, still curing, and fresh concrete quietly absorbs carbon dioxide into its own hardening body. The walls were eating the exhale. The soil was a lung nobody had counted, and the concrete was a lung nobody had counted, and the two of them together were slowly stealing the sky. Twice, the team outside pumped oxygen back in. The newspapers called the whole thing a failure. The newspapers had it exactly backwards. For the price of a building, on solid ground, with a door that could open, we learned that a sealed world is not a machine that stays put. It's a wild thing with its own appetites, and it will always do something you didn't predict. The only question is whether you discover that in the Arizona desert, or 4 light years from the nearest help. Every hour of those 2 strange years is studied by the people who think about our ship. It's their scripture. Jane Poynter said afterward that she'd learned the atmosphere isn't a thing you live in, it's a thing you're part of, a breath you share with everything alive. On a generation ship, that stops being poetry. It's the plumbing diagram. So the living world can be built, but it has one non-negotiable demand, and it's the same demand your window makes every morning. Light. Earth's garden runs on a star. Ours is sailing away from every star there is, out where the sun shrinks to just another bright point in the crowd. The ship must carry its own sunrise. So next, let's go down to the engine country and meet the 2 fires. The small one that lights the world and the enormous one that moves it. The small fire first. The one that stands in for the Sunday. Deep in the ship's spine, behind the water walls, sit its fusion reactors, several of them, no 2 sharing a weakness, any couple of them able to carry the whole world on their own. Fusion is simply the sun's own recipe brought indoors. Light atoms press together until they give up energy. And its fuel is the loveliest part. Because what does a homemade sun eat? The key ingredient is a heavy kind of hydrogen found in ordinary water. 1 atom in every several thousand. Sitting tonight in your kettle. In the rain. In the sea. A civilization that masters fusion finds that a bathtub of seawater holds the energy of a small mountain of coal. The ship carries its fuel as part of its shielding, remember, wrapped around everyone like the wet of the fruit, and it sips. A few kilograms of that heavy hydrogen a day, roughly a watering can's worth of extracted fuel, lights the entire world, the farms, the lamps, the dusk, the dawn chorus. From the reactors, the power climbs the spine and becomes daylight. The long axis lamps and window strips waking the fields in ordered sequence, morning rolling down the length of the land like a tide, because the designers learned early that bodies and birds and bean plants all need honest days. The sun aboard rises on schedule, and it rises because a stoker crew, 6th generation, checked the fires overnight. On this ship, even sunrise is a craft handed down. It's worth lingering a moment in engine country, because the culture down there is its own quiet marvel. Through the long cruise, remember, the great drives sleep. But the small fires never do, and so the reactor watch never ends. Night shifts handed down through the centuries in an unbroken chain, grandmother to apprentice, like a flame carried cupped through wind. The engineers keep a log, and by the middle of the voyage, it's the oldest, continuously written document the crew possesses. Every shift for 500 years, signed and noted. Storms of no consequence, readings steady, all quiet, in hand after hand after hand. The early entries in a language drifting toward the antique. Apprentices, when they finish their years of training, make a promise in front of the watch. And though every generation rewords it, the sense never changes. They promise the morning. Not victory, not glory, nothing a recruiting poster would want. Just that the lamps will come on tomorrow and the day after, for people they'll never meet, the way the lamps came on for them. The people who plan these voyages say the engine watch matters far beyond the engineering, because it does something subtle to the whole ship's soul. Every world needs somewhere it can point to and say, that part never stops. On Earth, tonight, it's the hum in your walls, the grid quietly minded by strangers on shift while everyone else sleeps. Aboard, it's the watch. Somebody is always awake under the fields, keeping the small suns fed. And every child aboard grows up knowing it, the way you once knew, without ever being told, that somewhere behind the night there were adults still up, and the world was being looked after. The enormous fire is another matter, and to respect it you have to feel the cruel arithmetic first. Here it is, in kitchen terms. To go faster, you burn fuel, but the fuel you'll burn later is cargo now. So you burn extra fuel just to carry it, and extra to carry that extra, and so on, compounding, a tax on a tax. Every additional bit of speed costs more than the last bit did. That spiral is the tyranny that rules all rocketry. And for a ship the size of a town, it becomes almost comic. Run the numbers for our Ark, a few billion tons of world and water and soil, brought up to just 1% of the speed of light. The energy bill for that single push lands on the order of 10,000 years of humanity's entire current output. 10,000 years spent on acceleration once. On another of our nights together, we climbed a ladder that ranks civilizations by the energy they command, and here's where tonight's ship hangs on it. A generation ship is what a civilization builds partway up the first rung, when it has tamed its home star's neighborhood, mines its asteroids, and can spend a continent's power on a promise. We can't build this tonight. That's not the sad part of the story. The sad part would be if the universe forbade it, and the universe doesn't. It just posts the price and waits, and the designs for spending it already fill a shelf. You've met Orion, the drumbeat of tiny suns against a great steel plate. Still, honestly, the brute's simplest way anyone has found to move a city. You've met the Daedalus line, the fusion torches, hundreds of pellet stars, a second igniting in a magnetic bell. But the most elegant idea on the shelf leaves the engine at home entirely. And it comes from a physicist named Robert Forward, a man famous for ideas one size too large for his century. His question was sly. Why must a ship carry its engine at all? Build the engine in home orbit, an array of lasers the size of a sea, and build the ship as a sail, vast and thinner than a soap bubble. Then push. The light itself does the shoving, and light, wonderfully, weighs nothing you have to carry. The ship spends no fuel because the ship has no fuel. There are serious plans today, scaled down to start, aiming to throw wafer-sized scouts at a fifth of the speed of light toward the nearest stars this century. Cameras the size of stamps, riding beams of light. Keep those little scouts in mind. They go ahead of everything tonight, and they matter at the far end. But notice what the sail really burns. Not fuel. Trust. The beam must stay aimed and maintained and paid for by the civilization back home for decades after the ship has already left, when nothing forces anyone to keep the light on. A laser sail ship is a bet placed by the grandparents that the great-grandchildren of strangers will keep a promise. Every propulsion scheme on the shelf turns out to smuggle in something human like that. The engines are physics. Choosing to fire them is not. Our ark, being a town and not a wafer, takes the patient road. Call it 1% of light, give or take, bought with fusion and thrift over years of gentle push. At that pace, the nearest stars are 4 or 5 centuries away, 16, 18, 20 generations, ship time and home time agreeing to the minute, because at these speeds the famous clock tricks of relativity stay asleep. And once the push is done, the strangest era of the voyage begins. The cruise. The engines go quiet, possibly for 300 years. Nothing outside moves. The stars are so far that even at starship speed, the constellations hold their shapes decade after decade. The same star map over the same gardens, grandmother to grandchild. The loudest things in the universe are the ventilation's soft wind and the water in the walls. Navigation becomes a monk's craft. Tiny trims measured against the galaxy's own lighthouses. The spinning corpses of exploded stars that tick like clocks across the dark, each one known by its rhythm. The ship sails by dead stars' heartbeats and its own patience. And all through the cruise, a thread of light still ties the ship to home, though it stretches thinner in the strangest way. Radio and laser light cross the gap at full speed, so the ship and Earth can talk forever, but the conversation slowly turns into correspondence. A few years out, a question takes months to answer. Mid-voyage, the round trip runs the better part of a decade. And by then, nobody is asking questions. Both sides simply broadcast, steadily, like lighthouses that have given up on replies and shine anyway. And what do you say to a home you'll never see again? The ship sends its annual letter, births and deaths and harvest counts, and the choir's best recording, knowing Earth will hear it years late, the way you'd read a postcard from someone already long returned. And Earth sends the ship its news, its music, its inventions, a river of home that arrives increasingly foreign, in accents drifting season by season, describing fashions and machines and troubles the ship can't picture. Somewhere in the middle centuries, the truth quietly inverts. Earth stops being the place the crew are from and becomes the place their broadcasts are from, a beloved voice on the pillow speaking from very far away, growing stranger every year while losing none of its warmth. Ship children fall asleep to transmissions their great-grandparents requested. Nobody hangs up. The line just lengthens, forever, which might be the most honest picture of what emigration has always been. And the whole time, the fare for the second half of the trip rides quietly in the tanks, because Daedalus taught everyone the hard lesson. Speed is a loan. Every kilometre per second you buy at departure must be paid back, in full, at arrival, or you become a photograph passing through paradise. How the ship pays that debt is the finest trick of the whole voyage. And it's waiting for us near the end of tonight, with a certain wind. But first, the cargo. We've built the wall, planted the garden, lit the fires. Now comes the question the whole night has been circling. Who gets aboard? How many? And what do we owe the ones born halfway? Start the crew question with the coldest version, because it thaws into the warmest. What's the smallest number of people who can carry the human species? It sounds unanswerable. And yet people have genuinely worked it out. And the numbers land far apart in ways that teach us something. The first serious answer came from an anthropologist named John Moore, a man who had spent his career studying how small bands of humans actually move and marry and endure from island chains to the old migrations across land bridges. When space scientists asked him about starships, he treated the ship like what it is, a small migrating tribe, and ran the marriage arithmetic that real tribes have always run, by firelight, in their bones. His answer surprised everyone. About 160 people, he said, could crew a voyage of 2 centuries. Not a nation. A village. You've stood in queues longer than the minimum crew of an interstellar ark. There were conditions, mind you, and they're the interesting part. Everyone starts young. Families plan around the ship's needs. Partners are chosen with care about relatedness, which every small village in history has managed with genealogies kept in memory and in church books. Moore's deeper point was gentle and a little proud. Humans have done voyages like this before. Every remote island in the largest ocean on Earth was settled by a few dozen people in open boats who never saw home again. The ship, he was saying, is not a new kind of human story. It's the oldest one with better plumbing. Since then, others have pushed the number in both directions, and the tug-of-war is worth watching. A French astrophysicist named Frédéric Marin builds whole crews inside a computer. Thousands of simulated souls who are born, pair up, have children, age and die, generation upon generation, while the program watches the bloodlines the way a lighthouse keeper watches the night sea. Run those simulated centuries thousands of times, and you can ask, coldly, which starting crews survive with their diversity intact. His machine keeps finding that under 100 can make it, even across a voyage of 6,000 years, provided the pairing rules stay wise. And pulling hard the other way is an archaeologist named Cameron Smith, who studies the deep history of human populations and who keeps insisting on a rougher truth. Villages sail through calm seas and shatter on storms. One bad sickness, one failed harvest deck, one generation with fewer daughters than expected, and 100-person crew has no cushion at all. His comfortable number sits up in the tens of thousands, 10 to 40,000, town-sized, because a town can absorb a blow that would end a village, and a town carries something a village can't, which matters just as much as genes. 100 people can pass down farming. They cannot also pass down surgery and reactor law and glass-blowing and midwifery, and the repair of the machines that repair the machines. Civilization is a bigger cargo than biology. The ship needs enough people that every craft aboard has a master, an apprentice, and a spare, and then the argument dissolves in the loveliest way, because the ship cheats. Along the spine, in vaults kept cold and quiet by the easiest refrigeration in the universe, rides the frozen library. Seeds by the billion, of course, every crop and wildflower the departure world could gather, but also frozen human possibility. Banked embryos and cells from hundreds of thousands of volunteers who will never board, donated the way people donate blood. The living crew can be village-sized, while the gene pool stays city-sized, refreshed each generation with new lineages from the cold vault. Children born aboard who are, in a sense, late-arriving passengers from the departure century. The geneticist's knot, untied by a freezer, which frees the real question, the one with no equation. Never mind how many people the ship needs. What kind of people does it need? And what do they owe each other once the door closes? Picture the selection, because it would be the strangest recruitment in history. You're not choosing heroes. Heroism is a sprint, and this is the opposite of a sprint. You're choosing the founding stock of a 500-year village, so you choose the way a wise village would. Farmers before pilots, midwives before physicists, though you'd love a physicist who can also keep bees. Machinists, nurses, teachers, cooks, weavers, welders, and for every skill, the temperament to teach it, because aboard this ship, every single person is half their job and half a school. The psychologists add their own quiet requirement, learned from every winter station and submarine and long expedition we've ever run. People need people they haven't met. In a crew of 100, by year 3, there are no strangers left, and something in the human weather goes stale. A town of 10,000 always has a far neighborhood, a face you've never seen, a chance, however small, of surprise. Room for Strangers turns out to be a life support system, as real as the water walls. Loneliness and crowding are both vacuum leaks. They just work slower, and while the planners are counting people, they have to count everything else, because the manifest of a generation ship is really an inventory of civilization itself, and nobody appreciates how long that list is until they try to write it down. Not the dramatic cargo, the boring cargo. The load-bearing boring. Somebody aboard has to be able to make glass, because windows and jars and lenses and labware all start there. And glass needs its whole small industry of heat and craft. Somebody has to make cloth, spin the wool and flax, weave it, cut it, because 5 centuries is a long time for trousers. Paper, soap, rope, needles, ink, yeast, alive and tended like a 5th herd. The medicines with all their delicate chemistry, and the glassware to make the chemistry, and the textbooks to remake the chemists, musical instruments, and the luthier's craft to keep them singing, because no crew sails 500 years without music. Write the full list honestly, and something dawns on you that the heroic version of space travel completely hides. A civilization isn't its monuments. It's a web of 10,000 small competencies, each one obvious until the last person who has it dies. The ship is the first project that forces us to see the web whole, count every strand, and pack it. In a way nobody intended. Designing the Ark turns out to be the greatest inventory our species has ever taken of itself. We'd learn what we are by having to fold it into a bottle, and at the heart of the manifest, in the most protected volume aboard, sheltered even better than the reactors, rides the library. Every book. And that's the easy part, because all the words our species has ever written fit in a case you could carry upstairs. But this library holds more than words. Every song, every film, every map of every city, every photograph anyone thought to keep, the birdsong of every forest, the genomes of everything alive, the recorded voices of the launch generation, taken down by lamplight, saying what they hoped for descendants, they tried and failed to picture. And because the ship trusts nothing to a single basket, it keeps the whole collection 3 separate ways, once in the cold crystal memory of its machines, once etched, the oldest way, in patterns on plates of metal and glass that need no power and no code, readable by anyone with a lens and patience, built to outlast the hull itself. And once, the way that matters most, in people. Because the librarians aboard aren't really custodians of shelves, they're teachers, and their real work is moving the library's heart, a little of it every year, into living memory, into children, who'll move it into their children. A fact stored in crystal is safe, a fact stored in a person is alive. The ship needs both, and it knows the difference, and its deepest law is that the second kind must never be allowed to run out. Which is why, when the designers rank the decks by importance, the ranking always comes out the same strange way. The school outranks the engines, lose thrust, and you drift for a while. Lose the school, and in 2 generations there's nobody aboard who knows what drifting means, or that anyone is drifting, or that there was ever anywhere to drift to. Then comes a day nobody aboard will ever quite describe well, because it's the day the door closes. The shipyard era ends. The last shuttle stands ready, and the launch generation, who all came from Earth or from Earth's near orbits, say the goodbye that no previous emigrants in history have ever had to say, because every emigrant before them could, in principle, go back, and they can't, and everyone in both directions knows it. Mothers hold daughters, old friends stand forehead to forehead. Then the shuttle goes, and the lock cycles, and the ship holds everyone it will ever hold. And that first night aboard is the strangest night of the whole 5 centuries. 10,000 people lying awake under a sky they built, listening to their world breathe. Each one of them privately asking the ceiling the same enormous question. What have we done? By morning the hens need feeding. And the answer begins arriving, the way it always arrives aboard, disguised as chores. But mark that night, because the ship will. It becomes the founding story. The night of the closed door, retold every year at the departure festival for the rest of the voyage. The way every people, everywhere keeps its crossing story lit. Then the village begins inventing itself, and the first thing it must invent is its law. Because the launch generation faces a task almost no lawgiver has ever faced honestly. They're writing rules for people who don't exist yet, who cannot vote, and who will outnumber them forever. The constitution of a generation ship is a letter to descendants, and its tenderest clause is the one every design study tiptoes toward and finally admits. Births. The ship is a garden of fixed size, and a garden of fixed size feeds a fixed number of mouths. Every family aboard lives inside that arithmetic. Births are planned the way harvests are planned, matched to deaths, matched to the pantry, a slow, steady flame of population held neither guttering nor flaring for centuries. It sounds severe from here, from a planet that still feels endless. But villages on small islands have always known this arithmetic and built kindness around it, and the ship's culture would too. A berth aboard is never only a family's joy. It's the whole world's. Because the whole world made room. Somewhere in the ship's calendar there would be a day for it, the way old towns ring bells, and that calendar deserves a proper look. Because the founders design it as carefully as the hull, and for the same reason. It bears load. A year aboard needs its architecture of days the way the cylinder needs ribs. So the calendar is built, deliberately, before departure. Departure night comes first. Every year, the retelling of the closed door, lamps carried down the lanes, the names of the launch generation read under the end cap windows. Harvest, of course, the great one. The whole population out in the long fields under the light spine, which we've visited already and which doubles, remember, as the water wall inspection, ceremony and checklist holding hands. Then, the ones no Earth calendar has. Crossing Day, when the counters tick past the voyage's halfway mark, celebrated once by every generation lucky enough to contain it. A festival some people wait their whole lives for and most never see. First light. Scheduled centuries in advance by the astronomers. For the year the destination star is due to become visibly a star of its own to the naked eye, a holiday with a date fixed before its celebrants' great-grandparents were born. And one night nobody plans loudly. The quiet night. For remembering. When the light spine dims early, and the ship lets itself be small in the dark for an evening. Every window lit low, the way you might sit up with a candle and let an old year go. People raised on Earth tend to smile at invented holidays, as if realness required 1,000 years of rust. But every holiday you've ever kept was invented once, by people who needed the year to mean something, and the ship simply does openly what all our ancestors did slowly. It furnishes time. The voyage is too long to live in as one blank corridor of days, so the calendar breaks it into rooms a heart can actually inhabit. This year, this harvest, this festival, the bells for this new child. 16 generations don't survive 5 centuries. They survive one well-built year. 16 times over, 500 times over. Each one furnished, each one warm. And the dead stay aboard, and this is the part that sounds hardest from your bedroom tonight and would feel holiest from theirs. There's no ground to be buried in except the ground the ship carries. So that's where everyone goes. Returned to the deep soil beds of the farms, to the living handful that holds more creatures than Earth holds people. Becoming, in time, the orchard, the wheat, the garden their grandchildren walk through. Nothing aboard is ever lost. Nobody is either. A child aboard learns early that the trees are, in the truest chemical sense, the ancestors, and that when the harvest festival fills the long fields under the spine, the whole living ship is one unbroken thread of the same matter, handed carefully forward since departure. We have versions of this instinct on Earth, scattering ashes in a garden, planting a tree for a grandmother. The ship just completes the circle and lives inside it honestly. Which brings us to the passengers who trouble the philosophers most, and they should trouble us because they're the whole point of tonight. The middle generations. Think about generation 8 of 16. They didn't choose the voyage. They can't remember Earth and won't see arrival. Their entire lives, birth to burial, unfold in the middle of somebody else's crossing, corridor and field and family and dusk, while the destination stays a dot that never grows. Philosophers on Earth have argued for a century about whether it's right to enroll the unborn in a one-way voyage, and it's a serious question. Sit with it a moment. Then ask yourself 2 honest questions. Did you choose your century? Did anyone ask you where you'd like to be born? Nobody, anywhere, ever, consented to being born. Every child in history arrived mid-voyage, aboard a world already underway, enrolled without permission in their parents' century, handed a language, a place, a set of unfinished problems, and a horizon they didn't pick. You did. I did. The generation ship doesn't invent that condition. It just shrinks it until it's visible. The way the ship shrinks the water cycle and the carbon loop. And once you see it that way, the ethics settle into something older and simpler. The thing parents have always owed children everywhere. Not a chosen world, because that was never on offer. A working one. A world with sound walls and honest maps, good soil, true books, teachers who tell you where you really are, and enough beauty growing along the spine to make the middle of the crossing worth being alive for. That's the covenant, aboard and ashore. The launch generation's whole task is to be worth descending from, so the crew can be chosen and the village can work. But now we've arrived at the true enemy, the one the founders feared more than any collision. It isn't out there in the dark. It never was. Micrometeorites make craters, and radiation makes shielding math, but engineering answers both. The thing that has quietly ended more human institutions than any collision is simpler and softer, and it lives inside, forgetting. And a 500-year voyage is, above everything else, a war with forgetting, waged with the strangest arsenal humans have ever assembled. Start with the words themselves, because they won't hold still. Languages drift the way glaciers do, slowly, unstoppably. Go back just 6 centuries in English, and the poetry is readable but strange, like a familiar room in someone else's house. Go back 10, and it's a foreign language, glorious and shut, needing scholars with keys. Now run that forward instead. A ship that sails for 5 centuries will hear its language bend mid-flight. 2 linguists, Andrew Mackenzie and Jeffrey Punsky, worked through what actually happens to a language sealed aboard a starship, and their conclusions are a little eerie and a little beautiful. Words for things with no referent aboard begin to wobble first. What does beach mean to a child of Deck 9, or thunder, or mountain, or horizon? The words survive in songs and stories, but they drift from things into symbols, the way Dragon did for us. The ship develops its own dialect within a couple of generations, then something closer to its own tongue. Rich in words for Spinwood and Axis and Bloomday that no dictionary from Earth contains. By arrival, the crew may well need the library's help to read their own launch logs comfortably. The first message home, sent at arrival across a gulf of years, might need translating twice, once out of ship, once into whatever Earth speaks by then, because Earth's language will have been drifting too. Nobody at the landing will speak the language of the launch. Not out there, not back here. That's not a failure of the voyage. That's just what time does to the sounds we make. Skills drift the same way. And here the ship fights back with a very old human technology, apprenticeship. Every craft aboard is taught hands-on, master to student, always with one master too many. The way the ship carries one pump too many. But the designers who think hardest about the long middle keep converging on something stranger and older still. Ritual. Here's the problem it solves. A procedure that matters once a decade is exactly the kind of knowledge that dies, because no one alive has done it twice. Write it in a manual and the manual sits unread for 40 years, in a language that's quietly drifting away from the one it was written in. But braid that procedure into a ceremony, a festival, a song the children learn before they know what it's for, and it walks through the centuries on its own legs. Picture the great inspection of the water walls timed to the harvest festival. Every seam walked by lamplight, in a procession that's half worship and half maintenance checklist. Rhymes counting the valves, in order the way old rhymes here counted saints. If that sounds fanciful, ask this instead. How long can a song carry a true fact? Because there are communities on the coast of Australia whose stories describe, accurately, coastlines that the sea swallowed roughly 10,000 years ago, landmarks confirmed today by seafloor mapping. Songs and ceremony carried a true map through 10 millennia without a single written word. Through hundreds of generations of retelling, essentially uncorrupted. That's the most durable storage medium our species has ever demonstrated. Not stone, not paper, not, if we're honest, hard drives, which rot in decades. Story. The ship's designers aren't being whimsical when they design festivals. They're choosing the backup system with the longest proven shelf life, and it happens to run on joy. So, let's actually watch it work. Here's a tale a ship child might be told at bedtime in the 3rd century of the voyage, and count, as you listen, what it's carrying. There was once a gardener, the story goes, who loved her garden so well that she checked the seals on her greenhouse every single dusk, whether or not the weather looked like weather. Her neighbours laughed, gently. Nothing had gone wrong in living memory. But she checked at dusk because her grandmother had, and one evening her fingers found the crack no eye had noticed. And because it was dusk and not midnight, there was time, and the garden saw the morning. That's the whole tale, and versions of it would sit in the ship's storybooks next to the songs. Now count what it smuggled aboard a sleepy child. Inspections happen at dusk, when the day crew is still awake to respond. You inspect on the calendar, not on suspicion, because the whole point of a schedule is catching what nobody suspects. You honour the ancestors by repeating their care, not their conclusions, and small faults found early are small. 4 rules of maintenance culture, the actual load-bearing kind, folded into a story short enough for bedtime and sturdy enough to cross 300 years without an editor. By the voyage's end, nobody aboard remembers that the tale was engineered, any more than you remember which of your childhood stories were quietly teaching you to look both ways. It doesn't matter. The gardener still checks her seals at dusk. Somewhere in every teller's mind. Forever. That's what culture is, when you hold it up to the light. The ship's slowest, surest machine, running on nothing but love and repetition. No moving parts, no power draw, rated for centuries. Which leads to the drift nobody can fully prevent, and the one the launch generation loses. Sleepover. Purpose. To you, tonight, the voyage is the obvious centre of the ship's existence. But you're standing at the launch, where the choosing happened. So what does the voyage look like from Generation 9? Walk their corridors for a minute. The windows show the same unmoving stars they showed their great-grandparents. No wall says anything today that it didn't say last century. To a child of the Middle Passage, the ship isn't a vehicle interrupted between worlds. The ship is the world, complete, obvious, needing no justification, and Earth is a story grown soft with retelling, half history and half lullaby, a garden planet where water supposedly fell from the ceiling for free. Arrival, meanwhile, hardens from a plan into a prophecy, something recited rather than expected. The mission, in the middle centuries, will survive the way the oldest true things on Earth survived. As religion, or as something shaped exactly like one, with the maintenance manuals as scripture and the engineers as a priesthood and the destination as a promised land no living person has seen. From the launch deck, that looks like decay. Look again from further out. If a story shaped like faith is what carries a true map across 10,000 years of Australian shoreline, then a voyage shaped like faith may simply be what a plan looks like when it's built to outlive its planners. The founder's real task isn't preventing the myth. It's making sure the myth is true, so that on the morning the prophecy comes due, the star outside the window actually grows. Underneath the culture, the garden itself drifts too, and the ship watches it the way you'd watch a sleeping child's breathing. A sealed ecology is small, and small living systems wobble. Every generation, quietly, a beetle species thins out. A strain of clover stops setting seed. Some unglamorous soil fungus that held a corner of the nitrogen loop together goes missing, and nobody notices for years because its job was invisible. On Earth, the wilderness absorbs these losses. Aboard, there is no wilderness in reserve, only the frozen library, the seed vault, the ship's deep memory, cold and patient along the spine. Part of the farming priesthood's calling, forever, is resurrection. Thawing the lost clover, reintroducing the missing beetle, running the little wars against the stowaways, because yes, life smuggles itself aboard everything humans have ever sailed, and some molds and roaches and mites will make the crossing uninvited and thrive. The ship's ecology is never finished, never stable, never safe to ignore. It's a fire that must be tended. Which is to say, it's a garden, and sickness walks the same corridors. A sealed town with one shared air supply takes disease with total seriousness. So the ship is built honeycombed, sections that can seal in minutes, air systems that can stand alone, a clinic deck that is half hospital and half ark, holding the frozen knowledge to rebuild medicine itself if a dark century ever burns it thin. The hardest scenarios get planned for. In other words, the way lifeboats get planned for, and then the plans are folded into drills, and the drills into rhythm, and the rhythm into the same calendar as the festivals, because that's where plans go to survive. And while the culture and the garden drift, the ship's own body is drifting under them, and here the news turns strangely good. Metal fatigues. Seals weary. Bearings wear. Over 5 centuries, entropy never once takes a night off. But remember the deepest specification of the hull, the one we set before we ever went inside. Everything openable, everything remakeable, shops that can rebuild the shops. A ship built that way doesn't merely endure its aging, it molts. Plate by plate, pump by pump, deck by deck. The crew replace their world around themselves as they live in it. The way your body has replaced most of its own cells since the person with your name started school. Follow that to its lovely conclusion. The ship that arrives, 500 years out, likely contains almost nothing that left. Original bones swapped in the 200s, skin renewed in the 300s, every panel of the farm's long windows some generation's careful copy of a copy. Philosophers have a famous old puzzle about a wooden ship repaired timber by timber until nothing original remains, and whether it's still the same ship. The generation ship answers the puzzle by floating through it. Of course it's the same ship. Same water in the walls, same soil breathing in the beds, same thread of families and stories and bees, unbroken since the shipyard. Identity was never in the timber. It was in the tending. The ship arrives younger than it left, which is a sentence that shouldn't be possible, and is simply true. But there's one drift no design aboard can answer, because it happens behind the ship, back home, and it may be the strangest twist in all of tonight. Civilization keeps improving after the launch. Engines get better, sails get thinner, reactors get hotter. So run the numbers on this. A ship leaves this century at 0.5% of light speed. 200 years later, home builds engines 3 times as fast and launches again. The second ship overtakes the first mid-ocean, somewhere in the long dark between stars, and arrives generations early. Their descendants have built harbours, grown orchards, founded towns. By the time the first ship's bow shield finally comes gliding in, great-great-grandchildren of latecomers waving from a lit shore at the descendants of pioneers. An engineer named Andrew Kennedy worked this out properly, and it has a wonderful name, the weight calculation, for any destination. Given how fast technology improves, there's an actual optimum year to leave. Launch before it, and you're overtaken. Wait too long past it, and you've wasted centuries you could have spent sailing. Which turns the oldest question. When do we go? Into arithmetic, nobody can quite finish, because it depends on guessing the future's engines. Here's what the calculation whispers, though, and it's worth carrying to the end of tonight. Every generation that looks up assumes the going is for later, for richer, wiser descendants with better machines. And one day, someone runs the numbers and finds the curve has bent. Waiting has stopped paying. The optimum year has quietly arrived, or passed. Nobody knows which side of that moment we're on tonight. Nobody has ever known. It's one of the strangest positions a species can occupy, and we occupy it right now, between the first small probes and the first true sailing, unable to see which century the harbour bells belong to. Now, before we let the ship arrive, honesty asks one thing of us. 5 centuries is too long for nothing to go wrong, and every serious study says so. The designers don't plan for a lucky voyage. They plan for an ordinary one, which means a voyage with at least one truly bad chapter in it, and they wargame those chapters the way port cities wargame storms. So let's walk one, a composite of the ones the studies actually run, and see whether the world we've built tonight can take a real blow. Say it's the year 218 of the crossing. A soil sickness gets loose in the grain decks, some quiet fungus that slipped every screening, and for 3 seasons running the harvests come in thin. The ship does what the founders wrote down for exactly this hour. Rations, calm and fair, and posted in daylight. The vault opens, and resistant seed from the frozen library goes into quarantined beds, tended by gardeners in sealed suits like surgeons. And the harvest festival is held anyway, that year and every year, smaller, quieter, but held, because the founders understood something deep about ceremonies. You don't hold the festival because the harvest was good. You hold the festival so there will be more harvests. Then, in the worst winter of it, an electrical fire takes a corridor of Section 9, and the honeycomb does its solemn work, doors sealing in seconds, the fire strangled by its own sealed air, and not everyone gets out. And now there are new names read at the festival, and a row of young trees in the orchard that everyone aboard knows the meaning of. Hard years make hard questions. A generation grows up in the lean stretch, and some of them, understandably, look at the rules and the rations and ask the forbidden one out loud, "Why are we doing this at all? Whose voyage is this?" And here the ship's answer is strange and absolute. And it was written into the geometry before anyone boarded. There is no back. Turning around costs exactly what arriving costs, the same enormous braking, the same fuel, and then decades of sailing to reach an Earth that has moved on without them, that none of them has ever seen. That is, by every measure that matters, just another destination. Forward is simply the nearest harbour. The arithmetic doesn't argue. It waits. And slowly, the way weather passes, the bad chapter ends. The blight burns out against the vault's deep bench of patience. Section 9 is rebuilt by the very generation that asked the hard questions, which is how ships and towns have always healed, and the corridor they rebuild is, everyone admits, better than the one that burned. A century later, the whole dark stretch is a chapter the children learn, with its own songs and its own proverb, worn smooth as a handrail. The founder's proverb, from the founder's oldest craft. A garden isn't a thing that never fails. It's a thing you never stop tending. The ship was never built to be unbreakable. Nothing crude by humans ever is. It was built to be mendable, which is stronger, because unbreakable is a claim and mendable is a practice. That's what the ship would have to withstand when you total it honestly. Not the dark outside, the dark inside, the thin years, the doubt, and it withstands them the way it does everything else. Together, by lamplight, with the seed vault open and the festival kept. So let them go, at last. Let's say the arithmetic came due, and the ship was built, and the centuries did their slow work, the festivals, and the molting and the drifting words. 16 generations of dusks along the spine. Because everything we've built tonight has been aiming at one particular morning, and the ship has almost reached it. At the far end of the crossing there's a star, and for 400 years it was nothing, one grain of light among thousands, notable only to the navigators. Somewhere in the last long lifetime, that changes. It begins as a rumour among the navigators, the way dawn begins as a rumour among birds. The target star, tracked for 4 centuries as a fixed point, has started, ever so slightly, to brighten. Nothing a passenger would notice for years yet, but the instruments know. And then the astronomy club knows. And then every school child aboard knows. And something shifts in the whole feeling of the world that no committee planned. The prophecy has begun turning into weather. Within a generation, anyone who looks out an axis window can see it for themselves. One star among the thousands grown unmistakably bolder, the way a porch lamp stands out down a long, dark road. Children in the last era aboard grow up with something no generation since launch has had, a star of their own, visibly theirs, swelling by the year. The founders sailed away from a sun. Everyone in between sailed in starlight. The last generation sailed toward a morning, and you can watch it coming. Now, take the ordinary morning you lived at the very start of tonight, and hand it down 14 more generations to a girl of the approach era, because it's still the same morning, the same hens, the same lane, the same bean rows her ancestors are quite literally part of, except for one thing. In school, in the astronomy hour, she's given the lesson her grandmother's class never had. The star ahead now shows a disk. The teacher dims the room, and on the screen stands a little circle of fire, faintly banded, with a spark beside it that is not a star. That spark is a world. It has oceans. Everyone in the room has known that fact since infancy. And still, when the disk comes up, the room goes quiet. After lessons, she climbs to the axis and flies a while in the weightless middle of everything, between the small clouds, over the whole green length of her country, and from up there, some evenings, through the great end windows, she can see it with her own eyes, not a picture, not a lesson, the actual star, the one with her family's future beside it, standing in the dark like a lamp left on across the water. Her great-grandparents lived and died inside a sky that never changed. She gets to watch the front door of the future grow brighter every year of her life. An ordinary day. Gardens and rules and cousins. 4 centuries from anywhere. And for the first time in the whole voyage, visibly almost home, but beneath her feet, in the engine country, the oldest debt on the manifest is coming due. The ship is still moving at the better part of 1% of the speed of light, and every meter per second of it, bought with a civilization's ransom at departure, must now be given back. Daedalus, remember, couldn't pay. 50 years of flight for a single day of photographs, because stopping costs as much as starting and nobody could carry double fuel. Our ship has been carrying this problem for 5 centuries. And its answer is the loveliest piece of engineering in tonight's whole story. It doesn't burn its way to a stop, it goes sailing. Out ahead of the bow, the crew deploy a hoop of superconducting cable, unreeling it kilometre after kilometre, until a ring wider than the ship is long floats in the dark, humming with current, and around that ring blooms something invisible and enormous, a magnetic bubble, a field wrapped around the whole ship like a held breath. And into that bubble, thin and fast and absolutely reliable, comes the wind. The new star's wind, the same outrushing breath of charged particles that a young man named Eugene Parker described in the 1950s while the experts called it nonsense. Every star breathes it. The ship's field catches that breath the way a sail catches a gale, and the wind that has been blowing for 5 billion years leans, patiently, against 5 centuries of speed. There's no fire, no thrust you could feel, just a whisper of drag. Years long, the great hull slowing the way a tall ship slows as it rounds up into harbour air. It costs almost nothing. The star itself pays. I told you at the beginning of tonight to hold on to Parker's wind, that it would come back at the end to save the ship. Here it is. The most mocked idea of 1958, breaking 10,000 people out of the century-long dark for free. And the harbour they're slowing into is not a mystery, because the maps aboard are older than anyone's grandmother. This is what those little laser scouts were for, all the way back in the engine act. Wafers flung ahead at 1/5 of light speed, cameras the size of stamps, streaking through the destination system centuries before the ship, radioing back rivers of data that arrived, patiently, at light speed, generation after generation. And even before any probe, the founders knew more than you'd think, because you can read a world from a point of light. We already do it, tonight, from this side. When a planet crosses the face of its star, the star dims by a whisper, and the starlight that grazes the planet's air on the way past carries fingerprints, water, oxygen, the sharp signature of things that shouldn't last unless something keeps making them. The destination was chosen 500 years ago by people reading those fingerprints, the way you'd choose a harbour from an old chart. The ship arrives, knowing the coastline. What it can't know until it's there is the same thing no chart has ever told any sailor. What it's like. You can imagine what the probe letters do to life aboard when they start arriving in earnest. For the first stretch of the voyage, the destination is a number, a spectrum, a dot the instruments watch. Then, somewhere mid-crossing, the first close images from the advanced scouts finally catch up to the ship's antennas, having chased it across light years, and the dot becomes a place. Coastlines nobody has walked. A storm turning slowly over an unnamed sea. Mountains with sunrise on them. Real sunrise, the local kind. The pictures go up in the corridors, and the schools the way harbour towns once pinned charts in taverns. And the ship falls, carefully and collectively, in love. Naming begins, because humans cannot look at a coastline for long without naming it, and the wise crews make a ceremony of it, names drawn and debated and granted at festival time. So a child of the 9th generation might grow up knowing that the far white cape ahead is named for her great-aunt, the one from the story, and that when her descendants finally stand on it, wind in their hair, her family's name will be the one on the weather report. And one year the astronomy deck posts something that stops the whole ship for a day. Rain fell on the far world, on the day the probe watched. On a shore already named. Rain, real rain, on their own far country, a century before anyone can feel it. People aboard keep the printout folded in books, the way people here keep photographs of grandparents they never met. Homesickness, it turns out, can run forward as well as back. The ship spends its last centuries homesick for a place nobody aboard has ever been, which might be the most human sentence in this entire night. So let's stand on the last deck of tonight and look at the 4 doors the crew might walk through. because every serious study ends at these same four. Door 1. The chart was true. The world below has air near enough to breathe and seas that catch the new sun. And the landing begins, which is not a flag moment, but a gardening one. Shuttles go down carrying the deep soil, the seed vault's treasures, the hives, the hens, saplings raised from the orchard whose roots hold ancestors. It takes lifetimes, and that's fine. Nobody aboard has ever met a project smaller than a lifetime. Children born in the valleys of a new world will keep, for the rest of history, certain habits nobody ashore can explain, a way of touching walls fondly, a counting rhyme about valves, festival lamps strung in lines down the middle of the sky. Door 2. The chart flattered. The world is close but wrong, the air thin, the chemistry sideways. Then the answer is patience at anchor. The ship parks in the warm orbital sunlight it was built for, unfurls its mirrors, and becomes what it has secretly been all along, a harbour town, while the slow work of coaxing the planet greener runs down the generations. Another garden, just a big one. Door 3 is the one the founders whispered about. The fingerprints were honest, and the world is already alive. Green in truth, mosses or meadows or something with no earth name. A biosphere with its own 4 billion-year story mid-sentence. Then the crew face the oldest question guests have ever faced. And everything depends on them being the kind of people 5 centuries of gardens and festivals were designed to grow. You don't plough someone else's story. The studies that take this seriously all land in the same place. The ship stands off and watches and learns and takes nothing but light, because a civilization that crossed the dark by tending a garden it could never own is, of all civilizations, the one equipped to love a world it must never touch. And Door 4. The world doesn't matter. Some crews, the studies quietly admit, will look at Door 1 standing wide open, the beaches, the weather, the mad unmetered horizon, and decline. Too loud, too random, too much sky. Home is the long green country, under the spine where every atom knows their name. They'll fill the tanks, renew the bow ice, thaw new orchards from the vault, and point the ship onward, deeper out, toward the next chart, because somewhere in 500 years, the voyage stopped being the price and became the point. The species' oldest habit, wearing its newest clothes, over the next hill. One more star. And which door would you choose, 5 centuries out from your grandmother's garden? Whichever door, there's a morning that comes first, and it belongs to everyone aboard, and in a way it's taken me all night to earn, to you. The braking is done. The hoop is reeled in. The shutters open on schedule. But the light that comes down the spine now is doubled. Lamp light and true dawn, because through the great end windows stands a sun, not a dot, not a disk on a classroom screen. A sun with weight and warmth in it, standing over the fields the way suns are supposed to stand. The bells the founders hung 500 years ago, cast in the shipyard for exactly one morning, and rung for 5 centuries only in rehearsal, are rung for real. And 10,000 people, none of whom chose this voyage, all of whom were carried here by everyone before them, stand in the long fields under their own clouds, in the smell of soil that has crossed the space between the stars, and look up together at morning, arriving from outside for the first time in 20 generations. Every harvest festival, every counting rhyme, every quiet repair by lamplight, every name in the soil was for this. The garden has crossed the dark, and it's still growing. That's the whole trick, the only one there ever was. Not speed. Tending. And now, with the bells still ringing on that far morning, I can finally hand you the thing this whole night has been carrying, the way the ship carried its vault. We've been talking, all along, about you. Not someday you, not descendant you. You, tonight, in that bed. Because run back through everything we built, piece by piece, and check it against the place you're lying in right now. A world that spins, giving everyone aboard their mornings and their dusks on schedule. A magnetic field wrapped around the whole living country, quietly combing the worst of the radiation aside. The same shield our engineers dreamed of and couldn't afford, running silently under your floor since before there were floors. A blanket of air standing over your bed with the stopping power of 10 meters of water. The water wall you've lived behind every night of your life. A sealed garden that has cycled the same air and the same water through every living thing aboard for 4 billion years. No deliveries, no resupply. Nothing in but starlight, nothing out but warmth. And motion. Never forget the motion. Right now, the quiet room around you is crossing the dark at about 230 kilometers every second, riding the sun's long orbit around the galaxy, to a lap so large we've completed it maybe 20 times since the oceans formed. The last time we passed this part of the sky, the dinosaurs were young. You live on a generation ship. You always have. It's the oldest one there is, and the best one ever built, and tonight, for a couple of hours, you've simply been reading the owner's manual, and once you see it, you can't unsee the crew. Every objection the philosophers raised about the ship, every tender problem we walked through in the middle acts, turns out to be a description of ordinary life on Earth, just written large enough to finally read. Nobody aboard chose to board. You didn't. You woke up mid-voyage, a few hundred generations into a crossing with no port and no captain, aboard a vessel already underway, and were handed a language, a century, a bunk. The destination is unknown. Genuinely. Nobody has ever known it. The original crew are long gone, and everything they knew reached you the way the ship's knowledge reaches Deck 9, as stories and books and songs and skills taught hand to hand down an unbroken chain of the patient dead. We even have the middle generation's famous problem. We can't remember the departure, and we won't see the arrival. And we were still expected to keep the gardens running. And mostly, remarkably, we have. The covenant we wrote for the ship's children turns out to be the one we were always under ourselves. Not a chosen world, because that was never on offer. A working one, with sound walls and honest maps and enough beauty to make the middle of the crossing worth being alive for. That's what every generation owes the next, aboard anything, which means the deaf schoolteacher was even more right than he knew. Earth is the cradle of the mind, Tsiolkovsky wrote. But one cannot stay in the cradle forever. For 100 years we've read that as a departure notice. And someday, for some of our descendants it will be. Some children of this planet really will watch a shipyard fill with ribs of asteroid iron under the stars. Really will plant soil barns under construction lights. Really will be the generation that says the goodbye with no return in it. When they go, they'll go the way we've gone everywhere, gardens first. But tonight, I'd read the old man's line the other way around, the gentler way. The cradle was never standing still. The cradle has been sailing this whole time, shielded and provisioned and crewed, rocking its way around the galaxy with all of us aboard. We didn't invent the generation ship this century or last. We noticed it. Every blueprint in tonight's family album, the spheres and cylinders and slow green arcs, every one of them is a portrait of home drawn from memory by a species that has never seen its home from outside. Of course, the ship is mostly farm. Of course, the shielding is the drinking water. Of course, it runs on tending and festivals and teaching children the valves. We were copying the only working ark anyone has ever stood on. The design was under our feet the whole time, and if you doubt that, here's the loveliest piece of evidence, and it's already built. Remember the ship's frozen library, the seed vault riding cold along the spine, the deep memory the crew guards like treasure? You have one, right now, tonight, far north of your bed, on an Arctic island where the winter night lasts for months. There's a doorway set into the side of a frozen mountain. Behind it, down a long, quiet tunnel in the permafrost, Your species keeps a vault of seeds. More than 1 million samples, wheat and rice and beans, and their 1,000 wild cousins, sent there by nearly every country on Earth, nations that agree on almost nothing agreeing unanimously on this. Keep copies of the garden. Keep them somewhere cold and dark and safe, high above the sea, in rock that stays frozen on its own, so that no failure anywhere ever has to be forever. It's been drawn on already, once, quietly, to restore a collection lost to conflict far away, which means the system works. Seeds went in, years passed, the world broke something, and the mountain gave the copies back. And somewhere tonight, those lineages are growing in open fields again. Nobody who built that vault thinks of themselves as crew on a generation ship. But look at what they did. On a vessel sailing through the dark mid-voyage, destination unknown, the crew got together and backed up the garden, exactly the way the ship's designers say a wise crew always will. The instinct is already aboard. It always was. You belong to a species that keeps seeds in a mountain for grandchildren it hasn't met, and that, more than any engine anyone will ever build, is the thing that reaches other stars. So let the voyage settle out of your shoulders now, because your shift is over, and the ship doesn't need you awake. That's the last thing to take from tonight. And it's the softest. A generation ship runs on watches, and the watches change, and right now, all over the hull of this one, yours is ending. The gardeners of the night side are awake in their greenhouses, so you don't have to be. The grid hums, the reservoirs settle, the bees are folded into their hives, 10,000 quiet competencies are minding the loops of the world. Does the voyage need anything more from you tonight? Not one single thing before morning. The water in the glass beside you has been around the ship 1 billion times and knows the way without you. The air will keep looping past that leaf on your windowsill, trade-made, all night, the way it was made all through the centuries when nobody knew it was happening at all. Your body is doing its own patient maintenance, cell by cell, the small nightly molting that keeps a person seaworthy. Let it work. Set down the whole cargo of tonight, the shipyards and the frozen library, the bells and the counting rhymes, the girl trailing her hand along the warm hull. You don't have to carry any of it into tomorrow. It was never cargo anyway. It was a bedtime story about where you already live, and where you already live will still be sailing when you wake. On course, mid-crossing, gardens green, right on time, and if sleep is circling but hasn't landed yet, do what the ship children do on the nights when the star seems too far. Listen for the vessel. Every home is a hull at night. The heating breathes its soft wind down the hallway. The walls tick as they let go of the day's warmth, the way the light spine's country ticks at dusk. Rain, if you have rain tonight, is the water wall talking. Somewhere a fridge is keeping its small winter. Faithfully, like a vault along the spine. Those sounds are your section of the ship, sealed and sound, holding pressure, holding course. Sailors and station crews and everyone who has ever slept aboard anything will tell you the same secret. The sounds of a working vessel are the deepest lullaby there is, because underneath language some old part of you knows what they mean. They mean the watch is kept. They mean the hull is whole. They mean you're aboard and expected, and someone planted trees for you, and it's safe now to close your eyes mid-voyage, the way everyone you've ever loved has done every night of their lives. If you're still awake and you'd like one more journey, there'll be another one waiting on the screen to carry you onward. Otherwise, stay right where you are, crew of the oldest ark there is, halfway between harbours, wrapped in your share of the water walls, with the gardens breathing beside you in the dark. The stars will keep spinning while you sleep. Good night.